so much for attending, and I'll pass it over to Sherry Hoffman.
Great, thank you, Allison. Welcome, everybody. My name is Sherry Hoffman, and I have two roles here today. I am both the Director of Children and Youth Policy at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, or ASPE, which Allison mentioned. And I'm also the chair of the Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs, which is a collaboration of over 20 federal agencies and departments with youth-serving programs. And we were established under an executive order back in 2008 that charged us to do three core things. First is to coordinate and collaborate across federal agencies that have youth-serving programs to improve youth outcomes. Second is to share information about evidence-based practices with youth-serving organizations. And third is to operate the website that Allison mentioned, youth.gov, which is really a cross-cutting website for all federal information pertaining to young people ages 10 to 24. And I encourage you to go check that out when you have a chance. There's also a newsletter that you can sign up for that comes out once a month with information about what's affecting young people right now. And that's, the sign up for that is in the bottom left-hand corner of the home page. So today our webinar, Advancing the Use of Core Components, is really focusing in on that second charge that we have about disseminating information on evidence-based practices. And we have assembled an absolute rock star lineup of experts to talk with you about this today. I'm really excited. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then we'll turn to them shortly to start answering some questions about this core components approach. So we have with us today Catherine Bradshaw from the University of Virginia, Allison Dimnicki, who you heard earlier from American Institutes for Research, Sean Grant from Indiana University, Byron Powell from Washington University, and Sandra Wilson from Apt Associates. So we would love to get a sense of who you are, who's joining us today for this conversation. And would you all take a moment now to answer a poll question that will come up on the screen here shortly. We basically just want you to indicate the role that you kind of most closely identify with, but you can select more than one. So whether you're a researcher, evaluator, or a practitioner, policymaker, funder, or something that we missed in that other category. So we will take just a minute to see who we have with us. We'll leave that poll open for a minute. Thanks for folks who are introducing themselves in the chat. Good to hear from all of you. Thank you for joining us. So I'll just go ahead and tell you while we're waiting, while that poll is still open, what our main intention for today is. And by the end of this hour together, we really want you to understand what we mean by core components, why additional data is important for core components approaches, and third, how we can encourage and incentivize researchers to make that data available. So let's see, have we had enough time for folks to enter their roles in the polls there? All right, lots of researchers, evaluators, perfect. You all are the target audience for today, the key target audience. So 83% researcher, evaluator, a few practitioners, some policymakers, funders, and others. So thank you all for being here once again. Great, so we can go, I just want to mention too that link that's on the front, on the slide that you see right there is where the paper that we're discussing today is available on youth.gov. And if you go to youth.gov, you will see it pop up in the carousel. There are a few things that will show up, will rotate through for you on the homepage. And this is, I think, the second one that pops up once you get to the homepage. So you can find the paper there. And we hope you all leave the webinar and read it afterwards. Great, so let's go to slide 4. So the definition of core components that we're using in this presentation today is this: the parts, features, attributes, or characteristics of a program that research suggests influence its success when implemented effectively. And that definition comes from a paper. You see the citation there. It's available on the Forum for Youth Investments website, and Shoshana has also dropped that link in the chat for you there. And this paper, we all work together to put this out to really start to introduce this idea of core components to folks. And this approach is something that allows us to look across multiple programs for evidence not only about what works, but it's also how we start moving towards answering the questions of for whom and under what circumstances. So really starting to kind of hone in on those more specific questions in evidence-based programming. And I want to emphasize that this is an approach that is complementary to and not in place of other approaches that have been taken to build evidence, particularly those that the federal government has quite honestly, spent hundreds of millions of dollars of putting forward, which have mostly resulted in building registries of evidence-based programs. You may be familiar with some of the best examples of those: the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Evidence Review, the Home Visiting Evidence Review, Crime Solutions from the Department of Justice. Department of Labor has a registry like this, What Works from the Department of Education. These are all part of evidence strategies to build evidence. And this is, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're not talking about that we shouldn't do that anymore. We're really building on all of the evidence that those approaches have brought to us to begin to look across those programs and see what is showing up that's working in multiple situations. So some of you who are attending this webinar right now might have a different definition of core components. There's no shortage of ways to talk about this. You might have heard people talking about active ingredients or effective elements or kernels. There's lots of different ways this gets talked about. This webinar is not going to get into that. This is the definition that we are basing our conversation around and that this paper is written from. But if you do have questions about core components more broadly, how they're used, how they're developed, we highly encourage you to register for an upcoming meeting that is being sponsored by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation from my colleagues who are at the Administration on Children and Families. And that meeting is going to spend 2 afternoons really digging into core components deeply. It is their annual methods meeting, and the registration link for that meeting, which is on October 28th and 29th this year, is going to be in the chat box for you. So if you have broader questions, we encourage you to sign up for that and listen to some more in-depth conversations there. So we can go to the next slide. And yeah, you can go ahead and pull all of them up. So this graphic is from that Forum for Youth Investment paper that I mentioned earlier, and it explains the 5 steps for advancing the use of core components of effective programs. So where we're really focusing today is in step 1 and 2. It's in identifying and testing. And so program evaluations, particularly those that are rigorously designed as either a randomized controlled trial or a quasi-experimental design, can really provide insight into what those parts, features, attributes, or characteristics that influence the success of programs might be. And then testing those core components is going to depend primarily on systematic reviews and meta-analyses of those studies. So we will spend our time today talking about information that we need really to bolster our efforts around step 1 and 2, and we'll maybe host another webinar another day that gets into step 3 and beyond. So we can switch to the next slide, please. So as the Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs in my office and ASPE really began to explore these approaches, we came up against the same obstacle over and over again of not having enough data to really dig in and to do this work well. So the paper that we wrote that we're talking about here today is really meant to encourage researchers. So the 83% of you who identified as researchers or evaluators, great choice to come and talk with us today and give us your input. It's really meant to encourage you all to collect and report the data that we need for those kinds of systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Those are crucial to testing the core components of programs. And this paper is meant to also provide specific examples of the kind of information that we need. And we can drop the link to the paper again into the chat, but also remember it was in the first slide, which this recording is actually going to be available for you on youth.gov. So we won't necessarily be distributing the slides, but it will be available for you to find on youth.gov to get those links again. So to put together this paper, and a shout out to Allison Dimnicki, who you've heard of so far, who worked very hard to put this together. Over 2 years, we interviewed and gathered input from federal and non-federal experts in the field, including the 5 speakers who have joined us here today. And we also built on existing resources. So the list of resources that you see here, the 4 on the screen, each of these are tools that help to guide researcher decisions about what data to collect and report. Some of the folks here are responsible for putting this together and have worked on this for a very long time. So we really appreciate their expertise and that they were willing to give us their time to pull their ideas together in this paper. And then next slide. So this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, but the paper, what it boils down to is this, that we need you all to collect and report more information about setting, participant, program, and implementation. And these are the things that are really going to help us advance using core components approaches. So that is it as far as the background for what we're doing here today. And so we're going to switch now to a conversation. Those of you in the audience, please go ahead and drop questions into the chat. We're going to be reviewing that chat at the moment as we go, and we'll answer some questions as we can, as we need to, when in response to the questions that we have for the speakers, and then we will open it up to presenter or to audience questions at the end. All right, so I see that all of our folks have joined us on screen. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here today. And we are going to start with a question about why this matters. So Sandra Wilson, as a meta-analyst, why is having additional data important to you? What happens when you don't have it?
Hi, Sherry. That's a great question. Thank you. On the last slide that Sherry put up, she mentioned this, that we are looking for more information in primary studies on settings, participants, programs, and implementation. And those things are the raw materials for what becomes core components. And and I do core components work from a meta-analysis background, and really, you know, one of the primary purposes of meta-analysis, of course, is to summarize the findings from a body of research. And so we might be interested in the effectiveness of a particular intervention or a group of similar interventions for improving youth outcomes or whatever. And we do a meta-analysis to look at the findings across a number of studies. And what happens when we do that, one of the things we frequently discover is that the findings from studies differ. So even studies using the same design, same outcomes, same intervention, often you'll see that some studies result in better outcomes than others. And this is where this core components work comes in. We're trying to identify the sources of that variability from this variance of program effects, and identify the characteristics of those studies, settings, participants, implementation, and programs that are associated with that variability. So without detailed information about those things, we can't explore what matters in this variability of treatment effects that we see. So if we want to go beyond a single summary effect in the meta-analysis, and most of us do, we have to have detailed information about a range of study features to move forward with that. And what happens when we're doing analysis in this way, we use a form of regression analysis most commonly to do this kind of work. And when we don't have information about the key variables from the studies that we want to explore as potential core components, it generally means that we can't use that study at all. And so we're kind of forced to throw out perfectly good information because we don't have the right kind of information about programs or implementation or whatever. We do have some ways to use imputation when we're missing study characteristics, but it's not ideal. And so really, the more information we have about kind of key features, the better. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. Having heard your 15-second warning, I appreciate that.
Yes.
Great. Sandra, I wonder if you could just quickly answer Athena, who's a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, asked whether all of the included programs are evidence-based programs or effective programs to start with.
Not necessarily, no. And I mean, different people who do core components research do different things. I mean, there's lots of variability in how we do this kind of work. But generally speaking, You can use homegrown programs or programs where the evaluation study you have is the very first one that's been done, so it may not be evidence-based yet. And from a meta-analysis perspective, we like to have the full range of effectiveness, both the programs that are maybe not so good and the programs that are, you know, shows positive effects. So we can start to tease out what the characteristics are of the ones that are doing better, or identify the characteristics of the ones that aren't doing better and maybe kind of think about some of the things that you want to change about programs that aren't doing so well.
Great, thanks, Sandra. Yeah, I think that variability is what I have learned that's so important in doing this work. So we want it all included. And just quickly to answer a question from Almut, the key variables that were on the slide, Allison put it back in the chat for you, but it's setting, participant, program, and implementation. Byron, as an implementation scientist, why is having additional data important to you and the field? So what don't we know when we don't have that data?
Yeah, so the purpose of implementation science is obviously to develop a generalizable body of knowledge that will help us to increase the uptake of evidence-based solutions across a wide range of sectors. And I often think about sort of two main components. So the specific implementation strategies that can be used to move these effective practices into routine care, and then the types of factors that influence implementation success. And I guess similar to what Sandra was saying, the reporting on both of those elements is pretty poor in the field. And the field is also hampered by the use of really inconsistent language. And so that can make it very challenging to really understand how implementation processes and strategies are even operationalized, and how and why we would expect them to work in the first place. It also hampers our understanding of if and how implementation strategies or other interventions are adapted and tailored over time. Ultimately, it hampers our understanding of whether or not implementation efforts actually lead to improved implementation or client outcomes. And then again, certainly limits our understanding of contextual factors and other determinants of the success of implementation. And so I think, again, similar to our understanding of other interventions, it really clouds the interpretation of results for individual studies. It precludes our ability to replicate and incrementally improve implementation strategies. And then it really limits our ability to synthesize findings across studies and hence build generalizable knowledge about implementation.
Great, thank you, Byron. I just want to answer a couple of questions quickly. I'm seeing the ones that I can answer myself, and so I'm throwing those answers back real quick. One is about the 4 categories being quite broad, from Suzanne Harnett, and whether we'll get into the details. And I would refer you to the paper. So go to youth.gov, find the paper, and there's tons of examples for each of those categories in there. And then also there was another question about, could we comment on the value, potential, and complexity of creating standardized nomenclatures or taxonomies for reporting core components? The answer to that is not today. Please sign up for the OPRE methods meeting, October 28th and 29th, and that is the kind of discussion that they'll be having there. So great question, lots of people talking about that. There'll be another opportunity to answer those questions. So Catherine, as the editor of Prevention Science, why is it important to have this information reported in the papers that you review?
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to the conversation and talk a little bit about the field as well as the journal's perspective. But I think this certainly relates to other journals as well that are publishing research and trying to help build the evidence base. I think the first things that come to mind for me are transparency and reproducibility. You need to have transparency about what you're testing. We might say it's a family intervention. Well, what does that mean? Are we actually providing direct services to parents? How do we even define what a family is? Is it a few hours of consultation or an electronic nudge? Sometimes when people just say they have a component in an area, it doesn't really give you a sense of the depth and breadth of that. And thus it really reduces the likelihood that those effects could be reproduced somewhere else. And so I think those issues of transparency and reproducibility, which are so critical for the field and and certainly for the field of prevention science are very germane to this conversation about core components. When it comes to reviewers get a program to evaluate the quality of the research, and if it is not adequately described both what the content of the program are, as well as the implementation support. And I think that that's what's really important to this conversation. It's not just what you're testing, but under what conditions it's actually being tested, and the implementation support around that. And I think that that core components framework really draws equal attention to the content of the program as well as to the implementation setting and supports that are needed. And so I think that that is very critical for the field to recognize. For a long time, folks were using coaching or professional development and really not describing that in adequate detail. And it wasn't surprising that a lot of our findings weren't reproducing, because people were buying a curriculum or sending it out without really giving sufficient attention to the core components of the implementation support structure. Obviously, this impacts generalizability of the findings. If I go and purchase such program or implement it at scale within my community, if I don't have a good sense of the core components of the program and how it was intended to be implemented, I'm certainly not likely to yield those types of benefits. And one thing I personally find is a little bit challenging in this field, I do some work in this area as well, is that quite often we're using multiple components in a particular program and its implementation, and they might vary a little bit over time. We have some assumption that these programs are static, but quite often they're interconnected elements of the components. And so you might be testing a social emotional curriculum or a positive behavior support, but what that model looked like 5 or 10 years ago and what it looks like today could actually change quite a bit. And so I think it is really important for us to be thinking that these components actually can be even a little bit more dynamic over time. And so from an editor's perspective, that's all really hard to concisely say in 30 pages or less. I certainly understand that. And I think some of the tools that were shared here today, particularly around Consort, which Sean is going to get into, provide some nice succinct guides that can help folks around this.
Great, thank you. And just one question from Jacinda that came in, Catherine, that I think you might be able to speak to quickly, is when we're asking for more data for publication, does that mean that journals are now willing to publish non-significant findings?
Yes, we are willing to publish non-significant findings. In fact, we have a forthcoming paper in the journal about the importance of non-significant findings. Sean and Sean Grant, who's on the call, and Francis Gardner and I are all working together on a special issue in the journal Prevention Science. And we hope to feature one of the papers by Nick Axelrod and his colleagues about the whole critical role of publishing non-significant findings in the field of prevention science, and for any kind of science for that matter, and how important it is. And we don't want to just say the good news. We've also got to report what we are learning about things that didn't go so well, and kind of why that space is there.
Perfect, thank you. So Allison, let's dig in a little bit to the 4 characteristics that we identified as needing to be collected and reported. So given your expertise in conducting research and evaluations about local context and populations, can you talk about the kinds of things that are critical to report on with regards to setting and participants?
Sure. And so I think when we talk about setting, it's important to prioritize aspects such as contextual factors. So things like the geographic location, year, time, characteristics of a delivering organization, and the wider service environments, as well as significant events. So for example, the fact that we're in a pandemic right now is pretty important to describe if you're trying to do any kind of research or evaluations during the next year. It's also important to collect information and report on the expertise and background and any training that is given to the intervention provider. So for example, not the training during the implementation, but if all of the intervention providers are required to be licensed social workers. You can't just all of a sudden, have everyone become a licensed social worker at your site if you don't have a bunch of money, time, and ways to factor that in. I think what typically gets lost when people report on setting characteristics are variables such as economic opportunities or violence and crime rates in community, things like the financial stability or the finances of a site, the organizational climate and culture, the role of leadership, people's feelings about the need for and the degree of support for the program. So one critical feature from my perspective relates to the skills, knowledge, and training of the staff who are implementing the program. So for example, if we're talking about teachers delivering a mental health program, Do they already know enough about mental health, and do they already have the skills required to identify and refer students to a mental health program that we're trying to promote and scale up in a school? When I think about participant characteristics, people typically report on things such as race, gender, socioeconomic status, grade level. They might not necessarily report them in a nuanced way enough for you to be able to do the kind of work that Sandra and other meta-analysts want to do. So I think it's important to think about not just saying 55% of students were white and 45% were other, but digging deeper. But what I also actually think is really critical to prioritize are the distinctive characteristics of the people in the study. So the percent of people who are uninsured, the percent who are homeless runaway youth, indicators of risk factors. So, if there's racism or social isolation experienced, if there's involvement in the justice system, and then protective factors. I know I'm speaking to some of my friends and colleagues in the positive youth development world, but we really stress protective factors, and we really try to understand how to build those as well as not just focus on the negatives. And so things like leadership or advocacy or community service experience. And the last thing I just want to highlight quickly is the critical nature of reporting measures of responsiveness, engagement, and motivation to be part of a program. So to what extent are people that are going to be delivering the program excited about this, interested? They think it's going to be a value, an added value, think it's better than what's already happening. And these things play a huge role in people adopting and successfully implementing programs.
Perfect. I will throw into what you just said, something that Chris Ringwalt mentioned. Sorry, your timer's going off even though you already finished. Chris Ringwalt mentioned in the chat about variables affecting program performance like competence and enthusiasm of the implementers, which can make a critical difference. And I think that's probably similar to what you were just talking about for the motivation of the recipients of the program, that it also matters who's implementing. Great. So Sean, given that the consort SPI says to report on the interventions for each group with sufficient details to allow replication, including how and when they are actually administered, can you talk about the kinds of things that are critical to report on from your perspective with regards to the programs?
Yeah, happy to. And thank you again for the opportunity, and Catherine for the shout out to Consort SPI and our special issue in prevention science on transparency and open science. So to an earlier question, I personally am a huge fan of nomenclature, taxonomies, frameworks, checklists. I think it makes the life of the systematic reviewers and meta-analysts here easier. And I think it also just helps to organize a field and helps with these practical questions of, okay, great. It sounds like you're telling me to report everything. So what exactly should I report and what language should I use so I've understood? So in Consort SPI, we, for the intervention aspect, really focused on a checklist called Tidier. It's the template for intervention description and replication reporting. And it's essentially the journalist's 6 W's, the who, what, when, where, why, and how of an action or story. For the what, there are the materials that are part of an intervention, so any physical or informational materials that are used in the intervention. But from my perspective, the key what are the active techniques, the specific actions or strategies that are used in the intervention. For me, that's what core components are personally all about. And I really like the behavior change technique taxonomy, or BCT taxonomy, developed by Susan Mickey and colleagues at the Center for Behavior Change at University College London. And it's a hierarchically structured classification of 93 distinct behavior change techniques, mutually exclusive, mutually exhaustive, and they're non-redundant components. So I think using some taxonomy like that would really help the field. And if one doesn't exist in your area, thinking about developing one through a consensus-based process of key stakeholders and informed by evidence and theory in your area is something I'd be happy to chat about. In addition to the what, the who would be the intervention provider, like their qualifications, background, education, expertise, and any training or supervision for delivering the interventions. The how involves modes of delivery. So is it face-to-face, over the internet, over the telephone? Is it individual-based or is it group-based? The where is the types of locations where the intervention has occurred. Typically, at a minimum, you'd hope that folks are reporting things like geography and setting, but I think ideally the level of detail of something like the inner and outer setting categories of the consolidated framework for implementation research would be great. And again, a shared framework for the field that we're using. When and how much is the number of times the intervention was delivered or components of the intervention and over what time period. And the spirit statement, standard protocol items, recommendations for intervention trials, has a figure or a participant timeline where in it you can mark at particular time points in your trial what actions are taking place when, what components of the program are taking place when. So I think visualizing that is great. And with my timer, the two things I would just like to emphasize from my perspective: report on actual delivery and uptake. Most studies, if they report anything, report on the plan or design, but interventions rarely occur as they're intended. So for each of those 6 W's, report what actually happened, what was delivered, and what was taken up. And lastly, report it for every intervention in your study, not just the experimental intervention, but comparison interventions as well, because all of our effects are relative to a comparison group, and labeling the other group something just like treatment as usual or standard care doesn't really help us disentangle which core components are driving effects.
That's great, and this is the downside of giving everybody 3 minutes to speak, because you could probably talk for 10 minutes just about that last point that you just made, and folks would be interested the whole time.
I appreciate the timer.
So Byron, can you talk about the kinds of things that are critical when it comes to implementation?
Yes, and I think much of this will actually sort of overlap a bit with what Sean was just mentioning. So I think one critical area certainly is, again, the implementation approach, including the broad implementation strategy that folks are using, as well as all the discrete components. As Catherine was mentioning, oftentimes we're dealing with very complex implementation strategies and interventions that have multiple components. And so we've often used an approach similar to Tidier, developed by Enola Proctor, Curtis McMillan, and I, where we encourage people to name the specific strategy and all discrete components, carefully define them, really provide details about the actors involved and their characteristics, as well as the specific actions that they're taking to implement a given program or practice. We use the word action target, but I think this is another way of saying sort of what is the mechanism, or how and why is this strategy working? Is there anything about the timing or sequencing of this implementation strategy that is critical? And then things like dose, the implementation outcome affected, and then the empirical, theoretical, or pragmatic justifications. We can understand why people are using specific approaches. So I think whether you use that framework or something like Tidier, I think the idea is, again, describing strategies in a way that we can replicate them. Another thing that I would mention is sort of how are these approaches being adapted and tailored over time? And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Shannon Wiltsey-Sturman and her colleagues' work. She has developed something called the Framework for Reporting Adaptations and Modifications. And this really helps us understand, when modifications occurred, whether they were planned or not, who participated in those decisions, what was the process of adaptation, and sort of specific reasons, contextual reasons for adaptations. Probably not enough time to go into all the elements of that, but I think that's another really helpful way to understand how strategies and other interventions are adapted over time. And I think both Allison and Sean got into some of the contextual elements, but obviously in implementation science, context matters a whole lot. And I think we have a number of frameworks, including the theoretical domains framework and the consolidated framework for implementation research, which has been mentioned, and others that can help us to really define those constructs. And hopefully, as folks use similar frameworks over time, we can develop a better body of knowledge about how those factors influence implementation.
Awesome, great. So hopefully now we've given you a little bit of information about why this is important and what we mean by the additional factors. So let's talk a little bit about how we get folks to start collecting and reporting this data. I'm really encouraged by the number of questions in the chat and the engagement here. It sounds like you all are really trying to already do this and do it well. So Catherine, as your role with prevention science, do you have thoughts about how we encourage people to do more of this collecting and reporting?
Sure, I will kind of invoke some of my behaviorist roots along this line and think of 4 ways, and they kind of go in this order in my mind. The first is model, reinforce, require, and create a norm. So on model, setting up standards or invoking standards that are created, doing special issues or special features or editorials about how important this is, and featuring really solid work in this space. That goes very nicely into reinforce, whether you recognize individual papers that have done a good job or a badging process that is a nice way of reinforcing good work in this space. The next layer I think is require. You could put require first, but I kind of like getting the field moving in a direction and then setting the requirements so that way people have a sense of what's being required and asked of them. Otherwise, the requirement can feel a little like a punishment if they don't have a sense of what's expected before it becomes a bar to jump over. But certainly some journals have moved to requirements as elements for transparency or consort or different elements of data sharing. And I think the core component element is relevant here too. And I'd rather not start with the require and kind of move the field in that direction so that way it creates the fourth one, which is this norm, that this is something everybody's doing. And now I'm going to be doing it naturally and not picking a journal or not picking a journal because they don't require me to do that. So I think that those are kind of 4 steps in this. How do we create a change in the field? And I really appreciate my colleagues on the call here today who have created a lot of tools to provide guidance, not only for authors, but also reviewers, because many of our seasoned reviewers aren't used to reviewing articles with this in mind. And thus they haven't been thinking to reinforce or to require or to invoke these types of standards when reviewing. And to create a shift in a field, it requires a lot of people getting on board and having an understanding about that. And so I don't think you can lead with the punishment-based approach. You really have to set clear expectations of what you want, model that, and move towards a requirements-based approach. And that through that process, I think you'll create more of a norm in the field about greater transparency on the reporting of the core components.
Great, thank you. Sean, you know, your work with Consort's been really widely disseminated and picked up. So what are your thoughts on further encouraging this?
Yeah, I think it builds a lot off of what Catherine just mentioned, and we cover in sort of what we hope will be the grounding paper in the special issue, trying to get transparency and openness to be taken up in the research ecosystem. And I think the main takeaway is, you know, if this was a seminar originally for a prevention science kind of audience, use the tools from prevention science, implementation science, behavior change in this. So instead of the general population perhaps being your target or practitioners being your target, we're trying to change researcher and research stakeholder behaviors. So I think what's been really helpful for us, first of all, has been stakeholder mapping. So thinking about, okay, who needs to do what differently? What does a researcher need to do differently to normalize this in their workflow? If you're a program evaluator, how do you always have components in your workflow? Journal editors and peer reviewers, funders to incorporate this in their grant applications and updates for their grants, and a registry entry for your final payments, you know, trying to attach those things in that way. If you're a purveyor or you're working for a clearinghouse, having these be part of the standard data items that you collect and report out, so that those who are giving the information might realize they don't want empty cells in what they're handing out to people for things like program core components. So I think stakeholder mapping is a good one. And another one that we tend to use that's been helpful are program planning tools and frameworks. So as an example, Emma Norris, who is at Brunel University now, but was with Susan Mickey at UCL, has written a great paper on using the behavior change wheel for thinking about changing scientists' behaviors for open science. So how do we think about the determinants of a researcher's behavior to report program components, and then can we match that with intervention functions and techniques themselves and build a science of changing researcher behavior? And for Consort, we did something similar with frameworks for implementation science, like the theoretical domains framework and the CFIR. So whatever you're doing to change the behaviors to make things better in the world out there, just apply the same tools to changing the research ecosystem would be my takeaway.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And Allison, you've done a lot of work with program developers and training and technical assistance providers. So what are your thoughts on encouraging people to collect and report more data?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Sherry, because I think oftentimes we think and focus on researchers and evaluators who come in to evaluate a program that's already been done for several years. So the disconnect between what people that are doing the program or people that are supporting implementation of the program can do in this area. And I think they can do a lot. So for example, I think program developers can be really thoughtful in their fidelity monitoring checklists or other tools and measures that they create and are part of their packages or information and materials they disseminate. And they could include things, tools, measures about setting, participant, implementation, and program characteristics. I also think they can help people think about how to collect this information in small chunks in an ongoing fashion so that it's not this, bucket dump at the end of a project or even in the middle, which is super overwhelming, but that it's thoughtfully collected throughout. So for example, maybe there's a brief checklist like we have a lot of that is about a specific session and the implementation of that session, but maybe there's another tool or measure that thinks about characteristics of the setting and of the people that are part of the program. I also think TA providers, and particularly those, and there's a lot of them on the call today that I recognize, who are working with partners to build evaluation capacity, can be very thoughtful and strategic in helping implementers reflect on the most important setting, participant, implementation, and program characteristics for their specific context and population. So I know Chris Ringwald and Brian Bumbarger raised these very important questions and comments that are like the million-dollar questions. So you have so much to report. How do we help people have a decision-making tool about how to get the right information collected, given they can't collect everything? And so I think that conversation and that tool, or that lofty end goal, really has to be grounded in what the program outcomes, objectives, goals are, what the theory of change is, who you're working with, and how you're using the existing evidence in the field. So for example, if you're using evidence-based program that was developed mostly and evaluated mostly with Caucasian middle-class youth, and you're trying to use it now with bilingual youth from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, let's be thoughtful in understanding how to document the adaptations made and the different characteristics of the setting. Maybe there's less full-time staff that are focused on mental health. Maybe there's less community-based organizations that can be mental health providers. So how do we get around some of those barriers? So there's not an easy, you would ask these 10 questions every time that I know of in the field, which would be amazing, Brian, to have already. But I think we can be thoughtful, and TA providers in particular who have this expertise can be thoughtful in probing those kinds of questions to think about what is the existing research evidence, for whom was that evidence collected, under what settings, under what circumstances, with what people, and what does that say about what we're trying to do in our own setting with our own program and our own participants.
Great. Okay, so we are going to ask 2 wrap-up questions here. Folks can be dropping their questions in the chat that we will start to get to. There have been tons there. Some have been answered. I hope you guys have been able to keep up a little bit. Our panelists have been dropping link after link in there, answering a lot of questions, and we'll make sure we save that and also have some way to post it when we post the recording so folks can see all the resources that have been given. But Sandra, what do you see as the greatest challenges to collecting and reporting this kind of data that we're suggesting?
Well, this is really hard, and I think everybody who's following the chat and contributing to the chat knows this. There's no Goldilocks magic list here of just the right amount of information, and so that's part of it, is that there's so much. There's so many potential things that might be a core component. It could be about the content of the program. It could be implementation strategies. It could have something to do with the interaction between who the participants are and what the program content is. So all these things might matter. And so that's the big challenge. But also, as you're doing this kind of work, especially as a meta-analyst, is, what we're looking for is we'd like whatever information there is about program content or implementation strategies or whatever to be reported the same way across every study. And, so think like some universal implementation fidelity measure that would work for every case. And that's pie in the sky and not something we can do. And so using some of these tools that we have that are kind of approaching a taxonomy or a framework that might be appropriate for particular disciplines, or developing or working towards developing that kind of thing would be great. But in the absence of having some universal way to report all this stuff, its detail helps us. So the more detail there is, the more we can turn that into something that might be usable as an analytic variable. But I mean, the challenge is it's hard and there's a lot. And I know that doesn't really help anybody, but there you go.
All right, well, we'll take it for now. And I think this is getting to what one of the questions in the chat was from Susan, who was asking about, it's particularly tricky about core components is the grain size, right? Too much specificity makes it harder to flag across studies, and too broad and everything falls into the category. So she asked if we had discovered the Goldilocks solution to that. So I think the answer is no, we haven't yet. But some of these tools that we have are getting us closer to at least an idea of some common reporting across these studies that we can better use for the meta-analyses. Great. So Catherine, can you take us home here in our panelist discussion at least, and talk about what you see as the greatest opportunities are to advance core components?
Well, you know, there's the actual components themselves, and then there's the framework. I think I want to take this to kind of a little bit broader level, because I do a lot of work in schools, for example, and they're very hungry for practices to improve conditions for learning and prevent behavior and mental health problems. And quite often they're not saying, I want this program or I want that program. They're wanting components. Right now we have schools that are very hungry for to address issues around equity, to address social emotional learning, trauma, school climate. And they're not going for a branded program, but they're wanting to have those kind of components represented. And I think, you know, the field has kind of moved in evidence-based practices. So you have to choose this one from a list, and it has to be just this name and implemented just this way. And many of us kind of came up in the list environment. And I think the field is kind of pivoting a little bit less to the list, because recognizing that those lists of programs are really often kind of combinations of different core components. And trying to find the magic combination of those core components that often get bundled under a headline of a particular name. And that's gotten very confusing and distracting for many out in the field. And I'm talking about practitioners, whether you're in a community setting or a school setting or some other public health venue. And so I think the whole field is very eager for this conversation and needs some guidance about how to make sense of the core components, because I think left to their own device, they do the shopping cart. They pull this piece from this program and this from that. Oh, I need a parent. I need a teacher training. I need something for kids. And they're creating their own core components based on this menu, rather than necessarily knowing what are the best approaches to addressing those core components. So I think that there's both an appetite in the field, and it's great that there's increased precision in the research side to be able to give information about which combinations of core components are most critical and which ones are really the active ingredients. I saw a couple of emails pop up. I think, Brian, you had one about, you know, what are strategies or methodological approaches that could be used to test these different core components. As many of us are used to doing big RCTs where we test a whole combo under a headline, and then we don't really know what our active ingredients are. I just know this works better than nothing, or business as usual. And so I think the field is really moving very positively towards greater methodological development that's refining our understanding of the core components. And I think there's a good audience for it out there. I just got an email from Frances Gardner, who she and her colleagues have a paper coming out in Clinical Psychological Science that describes a number of different innovations and the way that folks are testing the core component models, anything from micro trials to factorial designs, additive and dismantling studies. So I think there's a lot of really important work to be done around the methods for testing these core components, and that the audience on the other side is really eager for the results of those studies.
That's great. And Catherine, can you speak to just quickly one of the questions that came in from Brian about whether there are particular fields that are doing better at this than others that might be used as examples to pull other fields along. And others of you can give me a wave if you want to jump in on that question. This is our first audience question.
Well, I think the field of clinical psychology has been doing a nice job around this. Some of the early work that I read that was influential in my thinking was some of the Bruce Torpedo work. And John Wise has also done a lot of work. And in many cases, they could be able to manipulate particular elements of an intervention. I think it's a little bit harder when we get into the prevention area because there's so much kind of going on in such a macro level. So I think there's a lot more movement in the field of prevention science, but I think some of this started off more in the clinical and applied clinical work. So I feel like we're really moving in a positive direction of trying to bring these plugs in for more of a prevention-oriented group as we dismantle our interventions as well and have a lot to learn from some of our clinical brothers and sisters in this space.
Great. I just want to point out more of a comment that was in the chat, but I wonder if some of you on our panel would have thoughts about this, that Aaron wrote that using strong theories of change and theory-based logic models to specify core components from the beginning is crucial for setting the measurement and the reporting. So Allison, do you want to speak to that one?
Yeah, I feel like we so often jump to the what are we doing and not the what are we expecting this program and theorizing this program to do and where did we start and where are we trying to end up. And I really, really encourage anytime you're doing any kind of research, evaluation, et cetera, to start with that. Like, what is the theory of change or logic model for this effort and where are we trying to go and how are we going to track progress to get there? And everything else is kind of the second thing, honestly. Like, that is the core, I think, the guiding mantra to our work and should really inform what questions you're asking, you know, like what types of setting, program, participant implementation characteristics you're collecting really should all be guided by those research questions that are guided by your theory of change logic model.
Great. Sean, let me toss this question to you. Thomas asked, practically, how do we facilitate room for reporting significantly more details in papers without increasing paper length?
That is a fantastic question. Might be good for the editors, but I think when the question comes up a lot in the open science space, the question is sort of like, if we were creating the journal ecosystem today, what would it look like? Because it would look nothing like it looks like right now. A lot of it is still an anachronism of a print-based model. So like word counts when you had to print things out. So I know that there are certain issues with publishers and requirements and contracts to keep things to a certain word limit. So pushing up on those as much as possible, thinking about digital versions or copies that provide more details, for example, in supplementary info that's associated with the paper. I think registering all studies or giving all studies a ID number so that you can link papers across a study allows one to easily identify other papers, like a design paper that might have information on intervention. And then using tools like the Open Science Framework, where you can freely share just additional supplemental materials in a repository, linking those again to whatever papers are on the study, and so that those are freely available and accessible. But to change the question a bit in my head, because I think there's only so much you can do in journal word limits, is how do we optimize those? But it's really how do we make sure that all of the information on a program is discoverable and open access for users.
Anybody else want to jump in on that, Catherine? Or
yeah, I think supplemental tables and figures can be helpful. I often encourage folks just that I'm mentoring or collaborating with, maybe have another paper. Sometimes it's even a book chapter or report that you can publish literally your theory of change. And so that way it can be referenced and summarized. And because within 30 pages or so, and we're pretty generous at prevention science, believe it or not, with the 30, many of the medical and public health journals are about half that. So you have to find somewhere to park a lot of the theory and the just detailed, rich descriptions. And so for many program developers, I would encourage folks to write kind of that theoretical framework and describe the core components, and whether they use a taxonomy or have more of a conceptual guide for their work. Have a place that you can put that so you can reference it. The problem with a book chapter is sometimes it's in some book that you don't have access to. So if you could do some kind of open access or open science publication that would allow you to be able to link to that freely and have that referenced, you know, it's true in grant submissions too. because many granting agencies are going for shorter and shorter papers, and they want a theory of change, but they don't have enough page space to allow you to really describe it in great detail. So I think that encouraging folks, especially others that are kind of earlier in their development of an intervention or a model, or kind of combining them to be able to park that information somewhere in that way it can be referenced.
Yeah.
If I can add a top,
Go ahead, Sean.
I was thinking, the top tip if we're doing logic models or anything that's visual, do what Catherine said before you publish it. Open CC license, so then it's a cited figure in a journal article, so it's not stuck behind a paywall. You retain the copyright for it. That's a key one to make that open, accessible, and reused.
Owned by the journal where you publish it, and then you have a tough time getting a release to republish your figure. So if you could have it in some open science manual somewhere that you own, and then that way you can continue to reproduce it.
Nice. I think that is some super practical information that people are very excited they just got from the, right from the source, so to speak. So perfect. And I just want to acknowledge too, as the sort of the Fed on the panel here, that we have some responsibility in this too, and all of the grants that we're funding and the information that we're asking to be collected. And that's something that we're working on with our partners across the Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs, to think about how we make more of this available and ask our grantees to gather and report this information. Sandra, I'm going to throw you the toughest question that I've seen come in, and we've got 3 minutes left, so let's see how you do. So Chris Springhoff is asking, core components do not occur in a vacuum. They're typically embedded within programs. And actually, Byron, I think you may have some to speak to this as well, so maybe you can follow on. They're typically embedded within programs that may depend on the cumulative effects of a set of components delivered in a certain order that's been carefully considered and sometimes tested by the developer. So how do you capture that in meta-analyses? You're welcome.
Wow, thank you, Sherry. And Chris for that. I don't know that you can in the way that maybe you're thinking. And, you know, like I think it was Catherine who mentioned earlier, kind of some of the dismantling kind of studies and smart designs and all those kind of things that you can do on an individual study basis to try to unpack that. Meta-analysis is a lot less flexible. And to do something like what you're suggesting meta-analytically, I think we would need a bunch of studies of the same intervention, but different kind of iterations of it. And then we can explore those differences. When we get into doing that kind of analysis with meta-analysis, and any of this core components work with meta-analysis, it's not causal anymore. So we're talking about, you know, identifying features that are associated with better outcomes. We don't know if they've caused those outcomes, whatever those components are, until you go back and do a primary study on the thing. And so it's kind of a cyclical process, but I don't think we can do it, Chris, or at least not yet, but it's a great idea.
Byron or anybody else have thoughts on that?
I was going to 100% defer to Sandra on that one. So no.
Fair enough. And I think in the work that ASPE has been doing with Sandra around core components, what we say a lot of times when we run up against problems is, you guys, this is hard. This work is really hard, and it's why the field is where it is with it, that it hasn't already been all figured out and done, because we are putting a lot of effort into it. So I know there were lots of questions that we didn't get to. We will be saving the chat, and we will answer what we can afterwards, and we will try to provide additional resources with the recording of this webinar. But I just want to thank our, again, rockstar panelists for being with us today, and for all that you put in. Really, this has been a 2-year effort, and all of you were interviewed and gave your input and read multiple revisions of the paper and all kinds of work that you really helped us with. And so we are really, really grateful for that, appreciative of all your time and effort. And for the engagement from the folks that have been in the audience today. I've never seen this many questions come in, so we obviously have, hit a topic that people want to talk about. And I think there were great ideas in here for how to further the discussion, ways that we can continue to talk about this. Again, I encourage you to sign up for that OPRE methods meeting in October, where a lot more of this discussion, Sean's going to be there, Allison's going to be there, Sandra's going to be there, I'm going to be, lots of folks are going to be there. So we will continue these conversations, and we look forward to it. And thank you all so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Good day, everyone.